Let me first say, I will introduce the panel one by one. People will get 10 minutes each. We're going to all be very, very disciplined about our 10 minutes. I've already lost count of my time, so somebody will tell me. And then the special envoy from the United States of America on combating and monitoring anti-Semitism will speak. And in London, we know her better as Deborah Lipstadt. She spent a long time in London, not entirely through choice, because people know the story that she was being sued. Lots of people in the popular imagination imagine that Deborah was going into the courts to try to nail David Irving, which couldn't have been further from the truth. He used the British libel setup in order to force her to come to court in this country and fight in quite difficult circumstances. People will know, and if you don't know, watch the movie. And if you can go in a little bit more depth than the movie, you can read Deborah's book. All of the documents from the trial about Holocaust denial are on the website, which is Holocaust Denial on Trial, HDOT. And it's a real resource for anyone studying and teaching the Holocaust. So I will say a few words of my own, and then I will introduce people one by one. Danny Trom, who has a chapter in one of the 3 volumes that we are centering this discussion around. Rosa will tell you more about the 3 volumes shortly, but they are a really rather swift, intellectual set of responses to the 7th of October. And in his response, Danny Trom, who is a sociologist from Paris, says, one of the things he said was, you look at the accounts of people in the south of Israel on the 7th of October, and there was this common experience that people called for help. Often literally, they got on the phone to the police and to the army and to the emergency services and said, we need help. And there was no help. There was no help for most of the day, and for some people for more than the day. So Jews who lived in the south of Israel did not receive help. And Danny Trom says that experience of calling for help and not being helped is a characteristically diaspora experience. And he sets out quite an interesting argument about how the experience of the 7th of October, not only for the people who literally called for help, but for Israelis in general, brought them closer to the diaspora Jews and to the diaspora experience. And Anthony Julius, in his chapter, talks a little bit. His chapter is about what has changed since the 7th of October. What did it change? And one of the things he says in there is that Jews lost a certain amount of confidence in the institutions of Britain that we rely on to keep us safe. And he mentioned the BBC and the Metropolitan Police and the CPS and the universities. Many of us had already had those experiences in the Labour Party and in our trade unions. And Anthony says that there's this quite shocking, surprising melting away of Jewish confidence in Britain in those institutions, the institutions of the democratic state. And it seems to me that is another form of asking for help and finding that there is no help. I think that Jews have, in a sense, had that experience, and also an experience since the 7th of October, more and more of being assumed to be responsible for Israel. And of course, most Jews don't want to simply deny their connection to Israel or their defense of Israel, but the assumption of being put on the spot, put in the dock to answer for the crimes of Israel, real or imagined or half real, is in a sense something that I think brought Jews outside of Israel back towards the Israeli experience of being othered and demonized. And in particular, in Britain particularly, as people committing genocide. Philip Spencer will talk more about this. There's nothing more serious than the accusation that we in this room, scholars in Britain, journalists, Jews, are complicit in genocide. And I find it actually quite difficult to say really clearly, there is no genocide. Israel is not committing genocide. Israel does not murder children. Why do I find that difficult to say? Because I know that there is a completely respectable and normalized body of opinion in my university, in every university, in the institutions that we're talking about, that Israel is committing genocide and is murdering children. And I find it even more difficult to say that this is in fact a blood libel. And the reason I find that difficult to say is because the idea of the Israeli genocide is so well entrenched that there are just millions of people who are our fellow citizens who would be really outraged and disgusted by the idea that what they are doing is a form of blood libel. I find it difficult to say because it is something that is not considered polite or good manners or reasonable or responsible or proportional or scholarly at all. But I'll say it one more time. It is a blood libel. And people will talk more about that too, I think. So I'm going to hand on to Rosa Friedman, who is a professor of law at the University of Reading and who is a co-editor with me of these 3 volumes. She has been an enormous energy behind getting these 3 volumes out so quickly. They're not out yet, but the work is done. The manuscript is in, it's in production, and it was done in an indecently short time. And any of you who are journalists will think, like, what, 4 months is not short. But I can assure you, in our world, it is incredibly short. Rosa.
Thank you. Thank you, first of all, to the University of Westminster for putting on this event. I know that it's not easy to uphold academic freedom, particularly around what's going on in Israel and Gaza at this time. And it's very good to be in a university that does uphold that academic freedom and allows us to meet and to talk about some quite difficult issues. And also thank you very much to Deborah for wanting to be on a panel with us. It's a great honour for all of us, as I'm sure everyone in the room feels. So as David said, we have a book series as part of the Centre, and the book series focuses on contemporary forms of anti-Semitism, often anti-Semitism on the left, and often the parts of anti-Semitism that aren't discussed particularly within left-wing institutions. After October the 7th, I felt impotent, and I think many people felt impotent sitting here. I felt impotent about what was happening in Israel. I felt impotent about watching the rise in anti-Semitic discourse within institutions that I consider my home, the United Nations, universities, places that are typically on the left. I also felt impotent because the spaces for talking about different forms of Zionism were collapsing while everyone was joining together to defend Israel and to talk about the atrocities that had been committed. And I thought one way of addressing that impotence was to use the platform that David and I have as co-editors of this book series. So within a few weeks, we had put out a call for papers. We just said to people, can you write 3,000 or 4,000 words about your response or a response to the 7th of October? And I said to David, we'll give a hard deadline of 4 weeks, and within 4 weeks we'll have some contributions, and then 4 weeks later we'll send it off to the publisher. And he told me that I was mad, and then we did it. And we put out this call for papers quite far and wide, beyond our networks. We have people on the panel that I didn't know, but who responded to this call for papers and responded to this urgency of trying to have voices, platform to talk about not only the atrocities on the 7th of October, not only Israel's response to those atrocities, but about anti-Semitism generally, globally, in Israel and beyond. I think for many people it was an awakening for us. Certainly for me, growing up in Hampstead Garden suburb, in quite a privileged life, there was talk of anti-Semitism, but I didn't really experience it until I reached campus, and even then it wasn't the type of anti-Semitism that my great-grandparents experienced in pogroms, or that my friends' grandparents experienced in the Holocaust, or in 1948 in the ethnic cleansing from Arab countries. It's the low-level anti-Semitism that we're almost conditioned to just be okay with. After October the 7th, because my life at the moment is before and after, there was a huge wave of anti-Semitism that wasn't the right-wing anti-Semitism that we are conditioned to know exists. It wasn't even the radical Islam anti-Semitism that we have been confronting on campuses and around the world over recent times. But it was also an awakening of the left-wing anti-Semitism, particularly for me in universities. I saw many international lawyers' response, because I'm an international lawyer, their response to 7th of October was to talk about legitimate acts of resistance. It was to talk about decolonization. It wasn't first to stop and pause and say this was a terrorist atrocity and we'll express solidarity before going to the next stage. And we saw it in the streets of London. We saw it on the streets of Bradford. We saw it on the streets in Poland and Germany, and one of our colleagues will talk more to that. And we saw that these spaces for Jews to be able to discuss what had happened to us, not only in Israel but as Jews, was closing in. Anti-Semitism is treating Jewish people as different or other to all other human beings. And it can be fetishizing Jews, and it can be treating Jews as though they don't have the same rights and dignity. And the contributions that we receive for these books all focus on this othering of Jews, the lack of solidarity for the 7th of October, the rise in anti-Semitism in university campuses, the way that musicologists didn't express any sympathy or empathy for the peace-partying youngsters in the Nova Music Festival. We received so many contributions that we've actually got 3 collections, and there were many good pieces we couldn't include. One of those books focuses on universities and academia, because we know that much of the left-wing discourse that is framed as anti-Zionism, whereas it's actually anti-Semitic undertones and blood libels and all the other tropes, starts in universities. One is focused on anti-Semitic discourse, and that discourse can be political or other. And I've now forgotten what's the third one. One is Law and Society, which really looks at the rise in global anti-Semitism in many different countries. The books will be out in May. They can be pre-ordered, and they can be pre-ordered soon from the Centre website. I think the books are very raw. The contributions came out quickly. They are 3,000-4,000 words. Many people wanted more time to think and to add theory, and we said no to that. There is an urgency to them that I think is important, because it's an urgency that was felt within the community and amongst Jewish allies. An urgency to address the anti-Semitism that started at a low level, but that just ballooned after 7th of October, and it doesn't seem to be going away. Now, we've seen it in terms of in Parliament the other day. We've seen it in terms of the chants on the streets, and whether we think from the river to the sea is genocide, or certainly the chants of Chabaya, Chabaya are, which are calling for Jews to be massacred. We've seen it in terms of Jewish students being intimidated on campuses, and we've seen it in terms of attacks on Jewish buildings. I was in Porto last week for a football match, and the shul there is now closed to visitors because of the attacks on the shul, so we couldn't go and have a look around. We also know that there's been a rise in Islamophobia. We know that there's been a huge rise in I know from my students, in hijabi students, as they call themselves, feeling unsafe to walk around. We have to acknowledge that. We have to acknowledge that a lot of the rise in anti-Semitism and Islamophobia is actually coming from the right. We talk about this triangulation between the left, radical Islam, and the right of anti-Semitism. And we have to acknowledge that hatred towards minorities is on the rise anyway amongst this populist environment that we've been living in. But within that, we also have a duty as scholars with platforms, as people that care about anti-Semitism, to not just silence the voices of Jews, but to be able to talk about it openly and to be able to listen to one another and to understand the best ways forward. So that was the purpose of the book. We're very fortunate, as I say, to have Deborah, but also to have some wonderful panelists who will talk much more to the substance of their contributions. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much, Rosa. The next panelist who I want to introduce is Yehudis Fletcher, who is a research fellow at the University of Kent and has written a chapter brilliantly entitled Indecent Jewish Theology Post-October the 7th, the God of the Bathroom Floor. Yehudis is a scholar and an activist within the Orthodox and within the Haredi communities for women's rights and for lesbian and gay rights. And I will call on her to speak.
Thank you. First of all, I just want to say thank you to everyone who's come here today. Anybody working and interacting outside the Jewish community at the moment, anyone for lots of different reasons is feeling isolated, and just seeing a whole room full of people who are interested in hearing what we have to say is personally touching to me. So I really appreciate that all of you have come. So I'm Yehudis. I run something called Project Nachamu, which combats extremism within the Jewish community. A lot of my work has focused on sexual violence and forced marriage, so I also want to do a small preface that says if any of you have been affected by either of these topics or it brings up something, please seek help, and you can get in touch with either me or Rosa and we can give you some resources, because I am going to be discussing sexual violence that occurred on October 7th and how that reflects more widely into my work. So I've been campaigning and trying to raise awareness within the Jewish community about the problems that we have within it, about the systemic cover-ups that I've been the subject of. So I've myself taken someone to court, put them into prison, which makes me feel quite powerful. And besides for that, trying to talk about, I'm not really interested in individual perpetrators. I'm interested in systemic issues that cause repeated harm to lots of people. And I've been working on that since, for about 15 years now. I started raising awareness about forced marriage in the community, and when I first started talking about it, people told me that that wasn't an issue. I promise you it is, and it affects lots of people. And I have been talking internally in the Jewish community and also externally, and these are difficult topics for us to deal with. It's slow, and it's hard for us to acknowledge these things because as a community, we're used to feeling defensive. We're used to talking about anti-Semitism and external threats, and I'm talking today, and in general, about internal threats. So I live within the Haredi community in Prestwich in North Manchester. It's not a popular topic to talk about there, but hoping I have a slightly more receptive audience here today. On October 7th, I had no idea what was going on. I was in shul. It was Yom Tov. None of us had any idea of what was happening. I come from a Shomer Shabbos background, so nobody was using their phones, nobody was listening to the news. And when we turned our phones on after the end of the holiday, the bottom fell out of our world. We couldn't believe, and I certainly couldn't believe, that we'd gone through the holiday festivities, dancing in shul and singing and passing around sweets to children, when this was happening on the other side of the world and we had no idea. For me personally, in the days following October 7th, I kept vomiting. That's what happened to my body. And I was on my knees in the bathroom, and I shut the door, and I've got 3 children. I didn't want them to hear me in such distress. And I was on the floor, on my knees, hugging the toilet bowl. That's where I suddenly felt to myself, how much lower, what more distress can a person be in? As I'm a religious person, and I didn't know how to have faith. I just felt as if there wasn't anything to hold on to, and I'm holding on to the porcelain of the toilet, and I thought to myself, okay, but I cannot be alone. I could not face the fact that there's this aloneness, and therefore I had to find, that's where it comes from, the God of the bathroom floor, because obviously, in the end, there I was, and I realized that there is deep within the Jewish spirit, and certainly within myself as a Jewish woman, we are not alone, and I would continue not just my own personal existential fight, not just my communal fight, but facing outwards. I had to find the resilience, because I had to open the door. The children are waiting for me outside, so I had to find that spirit. And working from there, it started as a poem, which I won't bore you with, but then turned into an essay, which then turned into a book chapter. There was a double difficulty for me. I wasn't just devastated at what had happened in Israel. What devastated me and what absolutely terrified me was that a community that is focused on an existential threat that is coming from the outside is not a community that can deal with threats that are coming from the inside. I still am terrified, not just that other people are coming to hurt us, not just that Hamas rapists are going to come into Jewish communities and rape and torture our women, but that we as Jewish people will stop being able to talk about the sexual violence that occurs within our community. I am terrified that important discussions will stop. I feel so worried that as a community we'll be so focused on staying safe and alive that we won't be able to think about growth and development and healing that we need to do. We're a community that is recovering from the Holocaust. We're a community that's only a couple of generations down from parents struggling to parent through their own trauma. What for me, the Nazis attacked our bodies and murdered our community. But what they also did was they created traumatized families and generations of trauma that have difficulty in discussing these issues. And we were getting to a point where maybe we could start having discussions again, where maybe it wasn't so scary to hear from an internal person like myself saying, hang on, we've got things to talk about and think about. And now it feels like we've gone 3 steps back. I stood on the streets of London and protested because of the hashtag #MeToo, unless you are a Jew, because we were campaigning for women's rights organizations to recognize the sexual violence that occurred and was perpetrated against Jewish men and women. But I was hearing from people who I'd been lobbying, who I'd been asking for them to talk about sexual violence for so long. And so I was dealing with this duality that finally we're talking about sexual violence. But what next? Are we going to focus outwards and protect ourselves from external threats at the expense of growing and developing and learning as a community about how we can grow? What would it look like for us to thrive as a community without external threats? On the way in here, I was just telling someone, when my brother was doing renovations in his house, you know, I'm 7th generation British, but what was on the tip of my tongue, what I said to him was, have you built somewhere in this house for us to hide? Like, have you done some kind of false cupboard or something that we could... And that's a crazy thing to think about. We shouldn't be thinking in that way. We shouldn't be thinking that there's an inevitability that we will continue to be persecuted. But that thinking exists. And it stops us from developing. It stops us from growing. I think there's a threat here that what I'm saying can be, you know, it's not that I'm saying there isn't an external threat. I'm terrified of the external threat. I'm trying to make that clear. But I'm also terrified of that external threat dominating our community's response. I want internal accountability. I want accountability for external perpetrators. I want accountability for internal perpetrators. I want our community to be safe inside the home and outside the home. I talk about intra-community hate. Now, what does that even mean? I'm talking about people outside the Haredi community holding up ultra-Orthodox Judaism as something that cannot be, something that you can't ask questions about. We've got to promote it and protect it, because you need from people around to, I call it bris you and bury you, right? There's a kind of, like Rosa said, fetishization of holding up the ideal of, even the terminology that we use of ultra-Orthodox Judaism carries a kind of assumption that this is the correct way and the better way, or the most Jewish way to be Jewish. And I'm sitting here and identify as a Haredi Jew. I'm here to promote and protect and hold my own religious identity and the importance of that. And with that, I say we need to be safe from internal and external perpetrators. I think we have a communal responsibility here. So I guess that's my call for today.
Thank you so much. Next, I want to come to Philip Spencer, who is a great support for the work that we do and has always been a great support for me personally. He is an emeritus professor of Holocaust and Genocide Studies, and he wrote a fantastic book with Robert Fine on anti-Semitism and the left. Philip, you should know that we've just bought a whole big box full of your book, and I think they're on sale up there because that is a book that has not been widely enough read and talked about. So let me introduce Philip.
Thank you very much. I'd like to start with just saying thank you to a few people. I'd like to thank Deborah for coming in her very busy schedule at such short notice. It's a great privilege to have you here, and terribly important for us. I have to say that. I'd like to thank Rosa and David, especially for their amazing efforts in getting responses out in those books. And to both of them, and to Joe and Martina for organising this event at such short notice, and to all of you for coming out on a Sunday morning. It's just amazing. One of the things that I feel a lot, is isolation. And to see you all here is extremely moving to me, and to be on this panel is very moving to me, and especially the two people who've just spoken have moved me almost to tears. I want to talk about two things, really, in the limited time I've got. One is about a charge which I think is absolutely disgusting, which is the charge of genocide against Israel, which has now become a kind of common sense among so many people, including people I thought were my friends for decades. And I want to talk about what it means for our understanding and our experience of anti-Semitism, contemporary anti-Semitism, which is the focus of the centre that David is building. And so what is different now for Jews? But I also want to talk about what it means for others, or should mean for others. So let me, before I get into this, just start on a very personal note. I've lived through 3 waves of anti-Semitism in my life in this country. The first was in the 1960s, when my synagogue was burnt down by neo-Nazis. And we got it rebuilt. My father played a major role in it. But I forgot that event. Isn't that incredible? I buried that event until I was watching Ridley Road a few years ago, and I thought, wait a minute. And I had to ring my brother up and say, didn't our shul get burnt down by these guys? And he said, yes, of course. And then I just retrieved that memory, which tells you something about the power of repression. Then I lived through the 1970s when I was already extremely politically active on the left, and not just on the left, but on the far left. And I was heavily involved in the anti-Nazi League of the 1970s. Not mistakenly named the Anti-Nazi League. And we fought hard, and I nearly died, I have to say, on a demonstration. Somebody 150 yards behind me on a demonstration in Southall got murdered by the police. And it's only it was a few minutes, seconds, before my wife and I were hurried to safety by an Asian family down a back street. But this wave of anti-Semitism is something beyond my imagination. It's huge here, but it's global. It's in liberal democracies like Britain and France. I've just been to the United States to talk about anti-Semitism in Western Europe, and I talked about it in Britain and in France and other West European countries. And it's in the United States, and it's in Australia. How far away from Israel do you have to get for there to be demonstrations against Jews in Australia? People calling for gassing the Jews. It's in the global south. It's in South Africa. I was involved in the anti-apartheid movement for years. The shame of a corrupt, disgusting regime like South Africa having the gall to take Israel to court for genocide is almost suffocating me. It's in Latin America. The president of Brazil has just accused Israel of being the Nazis of today, or even worse. And of course it's in other states, Islamic states, and like Iran, and other totalitarian regimes. So it's a global phenomenon. Now, the question of genocide is core to this mobilization. It's now an article of faith, immune to evidence and reason. I want to say a few things about it, and it's in my chapter in the book, but 4 things. Firstly, people who make this disgusting claim know nothing about genocide. I have taught and written about genocide for 30 years. And there may be 1 or 2 students of mine in the room. There are certainly children of mine in the room who have known me rabbit on about this for hours. My wife sometimes says, "Do we have to talk about this now?" The convention, anybody can look the convention up. You look it up on the web, it's only a couple of pages. It's absolutely clear. It's not perfect, but it's clear what it says. There has to be the intent to destroy a group in whole or in part. There is no evidence at all that the Israeli state, especially the war cabinet, has that intent. Quite the opposite. It's said so repeatedly. What Israel is involved in is a war with Hamas. It's not a war it chose. It was attacked by Hamas. Secondly, Hamas, on the other hand, has expressed genocidal intent. That's what it wanted to do on October the 7th, and it said it wants to do it again and again and again. Thirdly, in the course of October the 7th, and this is what made you cling to the bathroom toilet, me too, it committed astonishing acts which are genocidal precisely as the Convention defines them. They are acts committed with the intent to destroy the group in whole or in part. And fourthly, those people who moved on from October the 7th immediately and subsequently, and have buried it, will not recognize the sadism and cruelty of those acts. And moreover, the deliberate nature of those acts which were intended to wreak trauma on those who suffered them and those who witnessed them and those who heard about them. And that trauma, of course, goes right back to the Holocaust, and the acts were designed to remind the Jews of what had been done to them before. So what are the implications for Jews? Well, first of all, what you have here is a disgusting inversion of meaning, of ethics, of politics, and of concepts. The term genocide is being turned against the very people who invented the term in the first place. Because the inventor of the term genocide was a Jew, Raphael Lemkin, a Polish Jew who lost 49 members of his family to the Nazis. It's even worse than that, though, because the Holocaust itself is being turned against Jews. When people say the Jews are the Nazis of today, they are inverting the Holocaust to attack Jews. I spoke a couple of weeks ago at a university in this country on Holocaust Memorial Day of all days. And the second question asked of me is, what do I think about the genocide the Jews are committing against the Palestinians on Holocaust Memorial Day? Thirdly, there are no taboos now on anti-Semitism. People can say things about Jews and want to do things to Jews openly on the streets of London and Manchester and cities around the UK and Western Europe and around the world that were not possible before. So the taboo is gone. It turns out to have been a taboo that didn't last that long, actually. And a core justification, and this is why the charge of genocide matters so much, is that now the Jews deserve it. I used to have an unworthy thought, which I kept pushing to the side of my brain. What would happen if Israel lost? What would the response be? And I used to think in my darkest moments that people would say, well, you know, look what they did. They deserve it. But now that's what you see, openly. So who is protecting us? At the moment, the state in this country and in liberal democracies. Although for how long, I don't know. And Danny Trom taught me this too. It's the state. And that's important. It's terribly important because, after all, the Nazi state organized attacks on Jews. So we don't yet have here the state organizing attacks. The state is sort of protecting us, although David's point about institutions and Anthony Julius's point is really crucial. But society is another matter. There is anti-Semitism now rampant in sections of British society and liberal democratic society, and not least in the universities. And the universities matter because that is where the next generation of politically active people are having their ideas shaped and formed and solidified. And I've got 2 minutes. So, what does this mean for Jews? Well, we have to defend ourselves. And we have to defend ourselves without hesitation. And I confess, like David, I have been hesitant. I've censored myself for a long time because I wanted to be part of what David called the community of the good. But a significant section of that community has betrayed me and us. But we do have to defend ourselves without hesitation. But we also have to get support and demand support from others. And not least, the solidarity of others that we need to continue to give. And I was very moved by what you said. But in my area of work, my area of concern, which is genocide, the charge of genocide matters to Jews in the way that I talked about, but it also matters to them. Because the victims of actual, real genocide, right, need to know that the concept means something. They need the solidarity from us and from others. Who am I talking about? In my book, I wrote a book about genocide since 1945, and if any of you need a cure for insomnia, I can highly recommend it. I listed about 50. That's a limited number. And since I wrote the book, there have been case after case after case. I'm going to come to the end. Let's just talk about the Yazidis, the Rohingya, the Uyghurs, and so forth. But beyond that, we need to reach out to everyone who cares about democracy, about rights, and about freedom. And Deborah made a speech the other day, which I read, somebody sent it to me, about those rights and about the threat that contemporary anti-Semitism poses to anyone who takes seriously democracy and rights and freedom. I'll finish now. There are some we cannot reach. There are people who, as I said at the beginning, are immune to reason, who are immune to evidence. Why? Because many years ago, the great French philosopher Jean-Paul Sartre wrote a wonderful book about anti-Semitism in which he said this: anti-Semitism is not a theory. It's not a set of ideas. It's a passion. And what that passion is about tells you nothing about Jews. That's why what Jews do or don't do is not the issue. It's what anti-Semites fantasize and project onto Jews. And when they say Israel is committing genocide, what they mean is we support the people who are committing genocide and we want it to happen. But we cannot give up on reason and evidence and democracy and rights and freedom and citizenship, because those are our core values. I'll shut up.
Thank you. Thank you very, very much, Philip. The London Centre for the Study of Contemporary Antisemitism is situated in London, and like our book, we have, to an extent, a British focus, but we consider ourselves to be a global London, a London that is a hub between the Middle East and Europe and North America and the rest of the world. And there are many contributions to this book from outside of Britain. Torkel Brekke has written a fantastic chapter on anti-Semitism in Norway. Anna Zawadzka has written a really gentle and insightful and experiential piece about how it feels to be a Polish Jew today. Danny Trom has written from Paris. A number of people have written from the US, such as Linda Maisels. So very much in that spirit, we have invited Ulf Hessler to speak. Ulf is a lawyer and is the editor of the German Military Law Review. Ulf, thank you.
Thank you, David. Thanks, everybody, for being here. And once again, thank you, David and Rosa, for publishing me. It's a great honor and a great privilege to be here. Now, we have heard Yehudis mention that feeling safe has become an issue. I have been able to grasp that exact feeling in the streets of Berlin on 7 November, when the Jewish Committee of Germany had invited for a memory demonstration of the victims. It was really present that people were not feeling safe, that Jews were no longer feeling safe in Germany. And I also, in conversations, heard about the feeling of isolation that Philip described. And with my professional background, in my professional life, I'm working for the German government, but obviously I'm speaking here in an entirely personal capacity. In my professional background, I would obviously turn to the law if I do not feel safe. In a rules-based society, in a rules-based international order, I would believe that the rule of law gives protection. And as a matter of fact, when I started with my military lawyer background to look at the way the legal community dealt with the attack and with Israel's subsequent operation, I got the impression that international law doesn't provide that safety. And I was kind of drawn into a couple of conversations by Rosa, and eventually out of these conversations came the impression, the idea that international law isn't anti-Semitism proof. And when Rosa sent the call for papers, I decided, okay, if this is a sentiment, then I have to prove whether it's right or wrong. And unfortunately, I fear that to a large extent it is right. And I will try with as little legalese as possible to explain how this happens, also hoping that all those in the audience who can influence policy decisions in one way or the other take up the baton and beat the drum to change these deficiencies, not only about international law, but probably also about many domestic legal orders. So what I will be doing is I will briefly illustrate how anti-Semitism is an almost blind spot in international law, then how international law is insufficient in combating anti-Semitism, how it is possible for this reason that anti-Semitism sneaks into international law through the back door, and even international law is capable of being exploited in support of anti-Semitic sentiments and viewpoints and activism. This is pretty much something Philip has described, which I will look at from a more legalese perspective, and then I'll come up with a brief conclusion. Can international law help develop responses to 7 October? There would be a lot of legal sources to look at: the right of self-defense, the law of neutrality, the law of arms control, the law of the sea, think of the Red Sea at this point in time, the law of state responsibility, human rights, international criminal law, and the Genocide Convention. Are these legal sources fit for the task? And I would say, well, not really, because international law does not address anti-Semitism through any written principles or rules. It does not have a definition of anti-Semitism that can be used to apply legal rules. Lots of legal rules require definitions that you can determine what is correct, incorrect, right or wrong, justified, unjustified. And for all these reasons, for the absence of the use of the word anti-Semitism and the lack of a definition, international law inherently cannot be anti-Semitism proof. Now, since anti-Semitism isn't known by its name in international law and in its principles and rules, it has barely been recognized as a fact to which international law could be applied. By way of not mentioning anti-Semitism, it doesn't seem to exist in the legal sphere, even though it exists in reality. That makes it look as though it is not present, as though it is not a challenge that the law could address. Law has, however, found an indirect way of addressing anti-Semitic crimes. The statute of the International Military Tribunal for Nuremberg, in Nuremberg, that tried the World War II war crimes and addressed the genocide of Europe's Jewish population by ancestors in my own nation under crimes against humanity. The Genocide Convention, which was afterwards developed. And international criminal law, by the way, continued on to the statute of the International Criminal Code. However, this statute again doesn't mention anti-Semitism. It mentions apartheid, by the way. So anti-Semitism was addressed indirectly and is still excluded from the legal texts today. And is this indirect approach really functioning? It is functioning if people tackle anti-Semitic crimes as the genocide they contribute to. But there's no guarantee that they do that, because this really depends on people's values. If people have different values, then they can do right the opposite, because they can interpret international law in a way complacent towards, or unintentionally welcoming to, or even informed by anti-Semitic views. And by way of being tacit towards anti-Semitism, international law has become vulnerable to anti-Semitism in exactly the way I have been trying to depict. Now I will go a step back, look at the insights that can be derived from existing definitions of anti-Semitism to link what I have just tried to outline to language, and then relate these insights to popular expectations regarding the purpose of law, so that I make another attempt trying to find out whether law can be used to address the challenges arising from 7 October. And I will then review the result of these two steps from the perspective of the law of armed conflict, and unfortunately I will end up highlighting and again illustrating international law's vulnerability to anti-Semitism. There are three definitions. The definition coming from the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, the Jerusalem Declaration definition, and the Nexus Task Force definition. That's an American definition more recently adopted. These definitions have a common ground. They capture certain actions directed against Jewish people. They depict the underlying motives for these actions. They clearly identify that Jews are affected, that they are the victims, and they record the effects on the victims. So they fulfill the criteria that a legal definition would need to have to be functioning, except that they are all in political documents. The modus operandi of anti-Semitism they describe is that Jews are being held to different standards of account, that then pejorative conclusions about Jews and the State of Israel are drawn, and that as a kind of sanction, Jews are excluded either in a socio-political or even physical manner. Physical exclusion means killing, obviously, just using the abstract terminology of a lawyer, not trying to shy away from the terrible reality. Now, this modus operandi translates into some of the unpleasant responses in the legal community after 7 October. All of a sudden, there was a higher threshold for self-defense when the State of Israel decided to counterattack Hamas. At the same time, there has been for a long time a lower threshold for asserting that Israel was occupying Gaza. The law of armed conflict requires physical presence of forces for an occupation to exist, but somehow scholars exclusively for the State of Israel designed a notion of occupation without physical presence, which was again quoted after 7 October as a limit to the actions that the State of Israel could take. Then there is an unwritten justification for violence, which includes a reclassification of Jewish civilians as alleged combatants. That has been used not only by Hamas, but also by Hamas supporters. At the opposite end, there were stricter criteria for collateral damage estimation in operations planning that were expected from the IDF. And then when IDF forces had been performing operations and were doing after-action reviews, they were held accountable to a standard based on the body count after the operation, where the law of armed conflict doesn't want a body count to be performed. The law of armed conflict wants forces to perform an ex-ante excessiveness assessment, and whether potential victims, are in excess to the military objective you want to achieve is not only a matter of numbers, it's also a matter of what you actually want to be taking out. And if you want to be taking out senior people, well-entrenched military structures, military intelligence, the body count can actually be pretty high. I mean, I'm coming from a nation where this body count was high exactly for this reason in World War II, because this was the only way of forcing the Nazis into unconditional surrender. So nothing is new about these legal principles, but here they are changed in a way to hold them against Israel and exclusively against the State of Israel. Then there are presumptions regarding the civilian status of persons and objects ignorant of realities of the ground. The IDF has been revealing a lot of photographs about the realities of the ground. Hospitals and schools having the entries to tunnels, hospitals providing power supply for intelligence apparatuses, and the many more examples of which you all are aware. In any other armed conflict, this would be enough to say, yes, these are military objectives because of the military use. In the conflict fought by the State of Israel, somehow the normal rules are not supposed to apply. Israel is yet again held to a different standard. And the last example, the attempts to politically instrumentalize the Genocide Convention against the State of Israel, was already explained by Philip in a way that I couldn't possibly do that. So now, if you look at all this and look at the usual way the law is meant to function, namely to support the weak, which is said to be its quintessential purpose, you see how the tension arises between, on the one hand, the line of argument built around Israel's strength, and then the ignorance towards the fact that Hamas on 7 October has used an asymmetric attack to actually turn its victims into the weak. And the lines of argument that I have just been explaining, they lead to Israel being held to account to that idea that the law is there to protect the weak, but Israeli and Jewish victims are not supposed to receive that same protection by the law, because it's such a black and white way of arguing that they are using. I've got 2 more minutes, so I will be trying to rush to the end. And I will just return to that notion of asymmetry, which has been a topic about many armed conflicts over the last at least 2, maybe even 3 decades. Asymmetry can be a method of warfare. And international law, the law of armed conflict, limits the use of the means and methods of warfare for humanitarian reasons. And this principle includes, rather than ignores, the utilization of situation-specific asymmetric warfare. So what I would tell my legal colleagues is that they are only using half of international law, the part that suits them, which they're exaggerating in a way that reinforces anti-Semitic sentiments, and they ignore the other half that isn't beneficial to their line of argument. in conclusion, I suggest that what I tried to explain was that the information space created by international law, by all these principles and rules that I have been referring to, makes it easy to conceal anti-Semitism as scholarly analysis, which then, by the way, leads to that conformism, that pressure for conformism that David and my other co-panelists have been referring to repeatedly in this panel. And if you look at all the lines of argument that I have been describing, then you can easily imagine how their cumulative effect is that the victims of the violence performed by a non-governmental organized armed group like Hamas are essentially not only excluded from the conversation about the protection owed to people by the law, but that even their interests are rendered legally unprotected, and that the state, in the current context, the state of Israel, that is responsible for these victims, is legally disempowered. And even though I'm not speaking about the International Court of Justice and its order, I would not be surprised if people were able to demonstrate that this order essentially disempowers the state of Israel in its effort to protect its citizen and its right of existence. And exactly this kind of exclusion is part of the common ground tackled by all the definitions of anti-Semitism. And on this very much unhappy note, that indeed international law isn't anti-Semitism proof and needs to be made anti-Semitism proof, and that we're at the very, very beginning after 7 October on our way to make this happen. I will stop here, and I hope I haven't overwhelmed you with legalese. Okay, I have. Sorry for that. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ulf Hessler. When David Irving attempted to silence Deborah Lipstadt's scholarship, which was a scholarship which protested anti-Semitism, he came to the courts in London, and we were all nervous. We didn't know that he would not lose in court. Even though he was a Holocaust denier, even though he was a far-right supporter of the Nazis, even though he referred to the judge in court as mein Führer, we weren't sure that he would lose in court. The battles that we have fought more recently are much more difficult to win in court and in public opinion, because they are not battles against Nazis or the far right or explicit Holocaust deniers. They are battles against people who are much more sophisticated and who are much more like most of us, really, which is they are much more liberal and egalitarian in their rhetoric. So I just want to remind people that even against David Irving, nobody was sure that there would be a win. I want to introduce Deborah Lipstadt without any further speaking. Deborah, it's really a pleasure for you to be here, and we would love for you to respond to the panel, to respond to what you've seen of the project, and to talk to us about your own impressions too. Thank you.
Well, first of all, thank you. Thank you. Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here in London, not on the task, that I have been assigned by the President and the Vice President and our Secretary of State. I say only a little bit in jest, and I don't even know if it's really at all in jest, that I work in a growth industry. Business is booming. And I'm the only one in the Biden-Harris administration who is praying for a recession, and so far I'm not seeing it. First of all, I want to thank David for arranging this. My schedule was packed, but when we realized that there wasn't a room during the week, I said I would change my flight and leave this evening so I could be with you here this morning. The project that you and David, you and Rosa have put together, and the many people who have participated is, and I know David mentioned that for journalists it seems 3 months, 4 months. For academics, this is Mashiach Zeit. This is the time of the Messiah. This is a true miracle, however you want to describe miracles. Also, I want to pay a particular tribute to David, whose work has been so important in helping me think through my own work. His book, Left Anti-Semitism, which someone I know looked at the title and said, he left anti-Semitism? I said, no, it's a... But then they read it and they got it and they understood it. It was a brave book to write, an important book to write, and I think it helped galvanize the fight against a true strain of anti-Semitism that we were seeing on the left and that too many people ignored. So for that and for much of your other work and for helping build this center with these very impressive people and the impressive work, all of us who hate anti-Semitism remain very grateful. I also want to take note of the presence of Ahmed Shahid, who is here. Ahmed is a good friend. I met him first when he began to write a report as a special rapporteur for the United Nations on anti-Semitism. And his report and then his project, his proposal for actions are really important. Too often, when we're talking about anti-Semitism, we do not talk about the UN in affirmative terms, to be somewhat diplomatic about it. But Ahmed Shahid's work stands out, and if you haven't read it, if you haven't seen it, you should find it. And Ahmed, we remain very grateful to you, and I'm grateful, personally grateful that you're here. I've spent the past week here in London, and I come from the Munich Security Conference, where I had some very significant, important meetings with foreign officials, with media influencers, with heads of online companies, etc., all, and placing for them, as I will do in a moment, the issue of anti-Semitism within the framework of national security. I also had a very, very, I think, important conversation with former Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, which is online in the America House, America with a K, America House website, and her firm and unwavering denunciation of anti-Semitism and seeing for what it is really very affirming. I urge you to listen to that. I'm going to step back a little, and some of you may have read where I've written a little bit about this, but I think it's important that we recognize that anti-Semitism is a prejudice like other prejudices. Too often, when people talk about the panoply of prejudices, they fail to mention anti-Semitism. It just isn't there. And yet it operates in the same way. A Jew does something wrong, oh, that's how Jews are. A Jew does something right, oh, that's one of the good ones. In my country, that is often said in terms of black people, it's said in terms of women, it's in terms of just a whole range of people against whom prejudice is directed. So I think it's very important. We make the argument that if you're studying prejudice, this should be part of it. It shouldn't even be a conversation of whether it should be part of it. But too often it's not. And then we see the reverse kind of thing, where when there is an anti-Semitic act, there is condemnation of it, but only with reference or in the context of all other forms of prejudice. Now, I'm not saying one should be privileged over the other, but I think if there is an act of racism, you condemn racism and not misogyny. Though misogyny definitely deserves to be condemned and combated. The example I use from my own country is when George Floyd was murdered by 4 policemen standing on him, one with his knee on his neck so the man could not breathe. It was clearly an act of racism. And to have condemned, to have said we condemn the racism behind the murder of George Floyd, and we condemn misogyny, homophobia, Islamophobia, and anti-Semitism, would have been ridiculous. But when it comes to anti-Semitism, you often get, oh, we have to place it in the larger context. And I often wonder why that is. I see scholars of anti-Semitism who only want to study it in the context of Islamophobia. Now, I'm not privileging one over the other. There is much to compare and contrast, but if you can only see it within the context of other things, you're saying, well, it's not quite worthy to be studied on its own. Jews somehow are not quite victims, and we saw that, Me Too, except if you're a Jew, and more about that in a moment. And I find that exceptionally disturbing. I find it coming both from non-Jewish world and from the Jewish world. Wherever it comes from, when there is that either failure to mention anti-Semitism or you only mention anti-Semitism within the context of all the other hatreds, even though the discussion is about anti-Semitism or the act you're condemning is about anti-Semitism, something is wrong. Now, having talked about anti-Semitism within the panoply of other prejudices, I want to step back and say, but it also has its unique characteristics. And I know many of you have heard this, and others have quoted me on it, and cited me on it, but there is the punching up, punching down phenomenon. Most prejudiced people, especially when their prejudice is directed at another ethnic or religious group, punch down. That person is not as smart as we are. That black person in my country, wouldn't be racism, is not as smart, is not as talented, is not as hardworking, certainly doesn't deserve to live in my neighborhood. His or her kids certainly don't deserve to go to my kid's school, and if they do, there goes the school. That's the charge you hear. But the idea is we need that person, but we need them to know their place. Keep them down. There's a punching down on Jews as well. We saw it during COVID especially. Jews are dirty, Jews spread disease. This is often, by the way, directed, going to Eunice's context, at Haredi Jews, Jews who are more easily identifiable in more than just wearing a kippah or a Magen David. But there's an added element in terms of the study or the understanding of anti-Semitism, and that's the punching up phenomenon. Because if you take the template of stereotypical charges that are part of anti-Semitism, just asterisk here, every prejudicial stereotype has a template of charges, and they're not interchangeable. Shiftless and lazy doesn't apply to Jews. Mafioso doesn't apply to blacks. You have, and they're code words, and often we talk about them as dog whistles or whatever. So what's the template of charges of anti-Semitism? Something to do with money, something to do with smarts, but not positive. I remember at one point when Anthony Julius was representing me in my legal battles, he was described in some newspaper as one of the cleverest men in England. That was not a compliment. Clever, conniving, conspiratorial, but they use their smarts to achieve their goals. Punching above their peak of punching, but small in number, but able to wreak havoc in a very big way, and able to do it secretly. Here, you see something that comes directly out of Christian theology and Christian attitudes towards the Jew, and that is the Jew as devil, because the devil was the only one in Christian theology, who could harm God, and who harmed God, and B, the devil does his handiwork and disappears before you know you've encountered the devil. You read all sorts of Christian stories, myths, sermons, etc. You've encountered the devil, and only then do you suffer the consequences. Well, if you take this template, and certainly much of it, by the way, comes out of the way the crucifixion story has been interpreted by Christians. By the way, I am not saying that anti-Semitism is strictly a Christian phenomenon, or it emanated from, I believe it emanated from the church, as some will argue it emanated earlier in Egypt, Alexandria, etc., but certainly from the church, early church in 1st century CE, Rome 3rd century CE, later on evolving in Martin Luther, Protestantism, and growing on. And then, of course, moving out of the church, Islam in 6th and 7th century, socialism, communism, which are the polar opposites of religion, yet adopting anti-Semitism, can we say whole hog? I don't know, in its entirety. And you see it in people like Voltaire, who hated the power of the church, but when he wrote about Jews, it sounded like the worst of the church, anti-Semitic church fathers. But going back to the stereotype, if you think of that stereotype, strong, more powerful than, richer than, able to manipulate, small, conniving, does their work behind closed doors, that's not lesser than me, that's above me. And that proves to be an existential threat to me, a threat to my existence. And if something threatens my existence, it must be stopped by any means necessary. So it gives anti-Semitism a very different construct and a lethal nature than just the punching down phenomenon. The other unique aspect of anti-Semitism, and this is something we should keep in mind, is that anti-Semitism is a conspiracy myth. Do not say conspiracy theory, because theories can be proven, and this is a myth, going back to the template I just was talking about. So it's not just a dislike, but it's think of the template. It's a conspiratorial myth that threatens my well-being, threatens my country's well-being, threatens my government, and therefore calls for the most horrific measures from expulsion, pogroms, expulsion, genocide, and everything in between those poles. So I think that's a very important thing to keep in mind as we study this phenomenon. And of course, one last thing that probably in this audience doesn't bear saying, anti-Semitism is irrational. And people have often said, well, you know, let me take it to a different level, deniers. The Holocaust denial is nothing but anti-Semitism. It denies that Jews were killed, and if you ask a denier, if you're in a conversation, you know, I make a rule, I'm about to get on a plane for 8 hours. I never talk to the person next to me until the plane is about to land, especially now when I tell them what I do, because I either hear all the thing bad, it's terrible what's happening to the Jews, but, you know, or I get all sorts of questions. But as the plane is landing, I sometimes, because if it's an interesting person, I want to know who they are, and if they're really interesting, I'll get their card and I can contact them later. But let's say you're sitting next to a denier, and the denier tells you, oh, it never happened, etc. The logical question, someone who was tabula rasa on this, would be, but why would the Jews have made this up? What was in it for them? And the deniers have an easy answer. Remember the template. Oh, well, they were conniving to do this. They were able to convince the Allies and the Soviet Union to hold trials, even though the Germans were not guilty. They were able to do all this. Why? To get a state. Remember, they'll do anything to harm others if it's to their benefit. That's part of that conniving quality. And I know that's not, you know, there's many reasons for Israel, and the Holocaust is certainly not the only one, but that's the general impression. And what else did they get out in the words of the denier of the Holocaust? Reparations, which is a fancy word for money. So there you have a rational answer for this totally irrational kind of sentiment. So I think the important thing is that when you try to convince an anti-Semite that Jews really aren't all wealthy or really aren't all white or really do not control, on some level it's a fool's errand because you're dealing with something irrational, and something irrational is very hard to make rational arguments against. The final point I want to make before I make some comments about the very impressive and short presentations that we heard is that I believe, and Philip referred to this in his presentation, that we have to reconfigure or rethink how we think about anti-Semitism. This is important. This is called for national government leaders have to do it. I spoke to some of your leaders in Parliament, and they understood this. I've been talking to people in the intelligence community, my own and overseas intelligence communities. And my argument is that we're dealing with a multi-layered hatred, with multi-layered impact. The first impact, of course, is on the welfare and the safe being of Jews and Jewish communities. And that, of course, alone would make anti-Semitism a valid thing to be fought and to be addressed by governments. Governments act in loco parentis on a national level. And what is a parent's real task? Keep your kid safe. Now, everybody has different ideas of safe. Some means get the best education, get the best training, but keep your child safe. That's what a parent's job is. And that's what a government's job is, to keep its citizens safe. And especially, certainly in democracies, it's vulnerable citizens. That's why we have laws about child welfare, child labor, elderly, laws on medications, on safe water, etc., because we're trying to keep people safe, and particularly vulnerable people safe. So were anti-Semitism solely a threat to Jews, that would be a valid thing for governments to fight. But it is much more than that. And as Philip mentioned earlier, it is also a threat to democracy. It is a threat to democracy because anybody who has accepts the conspiracy myth, which is the cornerstone of anti-Semitism, believes the Jews control, and you fill in the blank, the banks, the government, the electoral system, etc., the media, etc., etc. And that person is essentially given up on democracy. They don't think it's real. But it's more than just that. Bad actors, we call them in the American intelligence community malign influencers, which is a very mellifluous way of saying bad actors. Bad actors, whether they be other governments, other countries, whether they be NGOs, whether they be individuals, whether they be media outlets, use anti-Semitism as a means of making democracies look like failed states. If I can spread democracy if I can make it you feel like there is anti-Semitism in your midst, or if I can enhance the level of anti-Semitism in your midst, you think this country has failed. We heard it here from a number of our panelists about people feeling isolated, less safe, and some of the essays that David mentioned, people having less trust in their place in this country. I'm reminded, and since I have a German national here, of an incident in, I don't remember it, but I studied it. In end of 1959, beginning of 1960, there was an outbreak of anti-Semitism in the FRG, in the Federal Republic of Germany, West Germany. Synagogues, newly rebuilt synagogues, had swastikas painted on the outside. Cemeteries were desecrated. It might seem quite weak compared to what happened then, but consider the venue. This was Germany, 1959-60, and everyone was sure it was being done by Nazis. It was too soon after the war to talk about neo-Nazis. It were Nazis that were doing it, and there was great question. It was a time when Germany was entering into multilateral organizations, when arms deals were being made, etc., and the question was raised in the West, are the Nazis back? Is this a valid, even though Adenauer was head of the government, is this a reliable partner? Well, it turns out, we found out many years later, after a number of defections, that this was all engineered by the KGB and the Stasi, or its equivalents in East Germany and in the Soviet Union. Exactly for that reason, to make Germany a questionable ally, a questionable whether it really was, whether it was already a failed state, whether it was a truly democratic state. So anti-Semitism becomes some the Kochlöffel, the cooking spoon, to stir up the pot. It can't, a bad actor, whether it's a government or a non-government entity, cannot create something that isn't there. It can't create something ex nihilo, out of nothing. But it can build up when a fire is already burning. And so that becomes a threat to democracy, because the governments that we see using this, or we suspect are using this, are authoritarian governments, and authoritarian governments love anti-Semitism. No democratic government has ever had anti-Semitism as a plank of its governmental policies. It's engaged in anti-Semitism, including my own, which kept many refugee Jews in the 1930s and even into the 1940s from entering the country based on their being Jews. So I'm not saying it hasn't been there, and certainly your country knows, you know that as well. But as a plank, you don't have it the way you have it in authoritarian governments. So that's where it moves into the third level of a threat to national security and national stability. If your citizens, an active measure, an act of disinformation, dislocation, doesn't have to work for it to be successful. In mid-October, shortly after the Hamas attack on Israel, Hamas declared there would be days of rage. One Friday would be a day of rage. Many of you remember that, because I'm sure you kept your children or your grandchildren home from school, etc. Some schools were closed. I was in France shortly thereafter, and the CRIF told me that, they had asked parents not to keep the kids home, but some 80% of the parents kept their kids home. And I'm not being the least bit critical. If I was sending, it's very nice for me to make speeches, but if it concerns my kid, I have different measures of action. Nothing happened on that day, but the day was a complete success for Hamas, because Jews felt threatened. They changed their schedule. We closed down our schools, or we kept our kids home. Whatever it might be, it worked. So I think it's exceptionally important in your conversations, in your thinking about it, that you say, okay, you don't care about Jews, you don't have Jewish relatives, you aren't a Jew, or whatever it might be. If you care about democracy, if you care about national stability, care about this phenomenon. I want to, it's hard for me, just the short presentations, to go into depth. I'm very excited about reading the articles, but I heard the theme from so many of you, and it's a theme we all felt, this feeling of isolation, this feeling of living in, have gone down the rabbit hole, of living in being Alice in Wonderland, but it's not a wonderland. When the genocide charge was made, it sounded ganz meshuggah, like crazy, but being taken quite seriously and having an important impact. Judith talked about her concerns about our not looking at internal threats. I phrase it a little differently. What I worry about, and maybe to close on this point so that there's time for question, what I worry about, if you think of Jewish life on a spectrum, at one end is joy and at one end is oi. Jews, you don't have to have a Jewish education, you don't have to have a strong identity to feel that oi. And actually, after October 7th, there are many Jews who didn't identify, who suddenly were reaching out because they felt that threat. And it's important that if you're threatened, that you're aware of it, to be on guard, to be prepared, etc. But the danger is when the threat, and it's a little different from what you were saying, Judith, but it's along the same line, when the threat becomes the raison d'etre of your identity. When, we say in the Passover Seder, It's coming sooner than you think. Even though it's a leap year, it's on its way. Even though it's late this year. I always wonder, it's late, it's early, when is it on time? I don't know. But b'chol dor omdim aleinu lechalotenu, in every generation, those who rise up to destroy us. But this is the second part to that sentence. And whether you're a believer or not, if you're a believer, it's quite clear to you. If you're not a believer, you can still reinterpret it. V'akadosh baruch hu matzilenu me'adam. There's a positive. Oi to joy, and Purim sooner you study that, you read what Haman says. There's a nation, separate and apart, and we want to destroy them. And in the end, there's a success. Too often, and it's natural. I'm not being critical. It's a natural thing. You focus on the danger. But we should never let the danger become our raison d'etre, our reason for continuing to identify. So let me stop there so we have time for questions. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you. And I can see that people are hungry for their Sunday lunch. I will just leave you with one answer to a question, which is that we don't defend Jews against anti-Semitism because Jews are good or because any other nation or religion or class or gender is bad. We fight anti-Semitism because we fight a certain way of thinking about the world, and we fight in favor of the democratic state. And that means that we side with democratic Germans against Nazism and with democratic Palestinians against Hamas, and with democratic Muslims against fundamentalism, and with democratic Jews against those who are not so democratic, and against those who are, like some of the people in the current Israeli government, racist. So it's a fight to unite people who defend democratic thinking and democratic states across the world. Thank you very, very much.